7,000 schools destroyed, 10,000 school buildings damaged, more than 5,300 children gone, at least 69,000 dead, 18,000 missing, 375,000 injured. These were the official numbers given to news outlets and international organizations. Look at this landscape. Towns that were streets and buildings and schoolyards reduced to gray fields of broken concrete as far as the eye could see. Mountains that swallowed entire villages. Roads that simply ended in open air. This is what an 8.0 magnitude earthquake looks like when it tears through a province of 80 million people. This happened on May 12, 2008. The Wenchuan earthquake fundamentally changed China's golden era forever. And this year marks the 18th anniversary. Welcome to Unclassified China, where we deep dive on topics related to China. And I begin today with something personal. In 2008, I was only 13 years old. I was no longer in China by then. With most China topics, what I try to do is keep the emotions out of it. But this one was different. Every video I watched, every article I've read, I kept picturing myself as a 13-year-old student inside one of those collapsed buildings. And the thought that I could have been one of them if I had remained in China. I believe in the afterlife, and if were to know that after I died, the reason my school building collapsed was because someone cut corners on the concrete, I think I would probably turn into a ghost to haunt them for the rest of their lives. And I tell you this because I've been called a liar for covering tofu drag construction in China. I've been told I take things out of context. But when you see the same thing after 18 years, the same story that led to this disaster is still playing out, what exactly are you supposed to feel? From the year 2000, when China officially joined the WTO, all the way to just before the 2008 financial crash, the Chinese Communist Party viewed that stretch as its golden decade. While the United States was consumed by wars in the Middle East, China was welcomed into the global trading system as a partner, and it was a window of extraordinary growth and international goodwill. But the Wenchuan earthquake cracked that window wide open. This was on so many levels a turning point for the regime, and the earthquake exposed in full and undeniable detail that the rot beneath the surface was real. Tofu drag was real. School buildings where steel rebars are thinner than wires. Concrete so fragile it crumbled between fingers. And all of this just months ahead of the August Beijing Olympics, when the entire world's eyes were pointed at China. You can imagine that was a sensitive period. It would have been the first major crisis for the CCP in a while if they mishandled the response. And mishandled they did. The controversy wasn't simply about the fact that buildings collapsed during a massive earthquake. The question that tore through the country and the government moved quickly to silence was this: why did so many schools collapse disproportionately compared to the structures around them? Look at these parents digging through the rubble of what used to be a school, and they do so with their hands. No equipment, and just hands and desperation and this unbearable need to find something. And these are not people waiting for an official answer about the construction quality. They were there in the initial hours. People who already know by the fact that they saw it with their own eyes of what's happening. The government office down the road is still standing, and yet this school is in powder. The government's defense has always been the same. 8.0 magnitude, nothing will survive. This is literally what they will tell you if they try to talk about it. Sure, to some degree that is true. Earthquakes at that scale genuinely are catastrophic. But that defense collapses the moment you look at one specific campus. According to China Change, in their interview with a victim's mother, at Beichuan High School in the area, 2 newly built classroom buildings collapsed and buried nearly 500 students.
我赶到学校的时候，我感觉到就是周围的房子都没倒，包括就是60年代盖的那个老房子，地震之前的话，就说是危房的，可以说像那种砖缝结构的房子都没倒，连那个问都没有，唯独倒了教学楼。 倒下的数据下话就没有说看的就是有个框架架的那种，倒下的就是一堆粉末。
On the same campus, older structures remain standing. The same ground, the same earthquake, the same buildings belonging to the school, but the results of it. The buildings that were constructed recently with public funds and official oversight fell, but the older ones did not. If the earthquake alone was the responsible cause of this, the older buildings should have gone first, but they did not. Because the problem was never the earthquake. The problem was what was inside those newer walls. And the data make it undeniable. A 2023 peer-reviewed study by Professor Cao Yiming from Hong Kong University analyzed over 1,000 buildings impacted by these earthquakes. cross-referencing their construction periods with whether the county officials oversaw them or not, and whether that had a political patronage connection to the supervisors of these construction. And the finding was stark. Buildings constructed under politically connected officials were 83% more likely to collapse, while those built before the county started having connected officials show no increased vulnerability, suggesting, well, the CCP's involvement is the reason for this stark contrast. Across the province, investigators, journalists, engineers, and grieving parents documented the exact same thing. School buildings pancaked into rubble, while adjacent government buildings, telecom buildings, residential blocks remained standing, or suffered far less damage comparatively to the school buildings. Earthquake experts noted that schools were legally required to meet higher construction standards precisely because they housed children. China had a seismic building code long time before 2008 was around, but they kept updating it. So to say that there was no regulation in place was simply false. Schools were supposed to have reinforced concrete frame and proper anti-seismic measures built in. Of course, after the earthquake, there were many subsequent sort of reinforcement orders in place for various major cities across China, but that's already too late. After the earthquake, Chinese engineers and state media themselves acknowledged what parents already knew, which was that there is insufficient steel reinforcement, weak column beam joints, poor concrete mixing, inadequate seismic detailing. All of the hallmarks of these corners being cut, all of the hallmarks of tofu-dry construction. According to Lian Wei, the executive vice president of the Urban Planning and Design and Research Institute at Tsinghua University, he wrote in an independent magazine the following: buildings strictly constructed to civil planning specifications would not collapse during an earthquake. Any building that collapsed instantaneously, he wrote, must have failed to conform to those standards. Either the design was unfit or the engineering was. And that was a Chinese academic at one of China's most prestigious universities saying it quite plainly. And the fact is, after the admission came from the government's own chairman at a press conference on September 4th, they basically repeated and confirmed what was said before. Ma Zongji, the director of National Wenchuan Earthquake Expert Committee, initially said nothing about the collapse at all at some of those schools. He was silent until the question was asked by a reporter, which, by the way, just a side note, back then, reporters still had a little bit of conscience, or you could say that they were still allowed to have some conscience when it comes to reporting. Anyway, so the point was he, at the press conference, which was reported by China Daily, saying that the poor design and substandard building materials may have played a role, that building structures may not have been reasonable enough, construction materials may not have been strong enough. And according to the New York Times reporter Edward Wong, who covered the same press conference, said that Ma noted also something else, which is that local officials actually tried to exaggerate the earthquake's intensity to shift blame from poor construction quality. Yeah, so the corruption was not just in the building, it was the official response to the buildings. The chairman of the government's own earthquake committee, on the record, confirming it in the most, I would say, careful, minimal language possible, but again, still, that's pretty much confirming it. The numbers carry the full weight of that admission. According to UNICEF, which reported that almost 7,000 schools were completely destroyed, more than 10,000 school buildings were damaged, 5,300 were dead, there were children, most of them sitting in the class when the ground moved. These backpacks, laid out in rows on the open ground by rescue workers, each one belonged to a child who left home that morning. There's nothing but stark contrast in this entire situation. One case makes it, I would say, much more infuriating for the rest of the parents who will find out, which is the Liu Han Hope Primary School in Haiyuan Village, Beichuan, which is in that same town that all of the buildings of the school collapsed, but those around it didn't. It became nationally famous after the earthquake because its main teaching building stood largely intact while the structures around it were reduced to dust. All 483 students and staff were evacuated safely. Chinese media and netizens called it the most remarkable Hope School in history. The school had been funded by Liu Han, a mining tycoon who was later convicted as a crime boss, and his company, Hanlong Group, opened the school in 2005, and state media reported that the building had been constructed to unusually high standards with strict quality controls, and that is what saved 483 lives. Before his downfall, Liu Han had reportedly donated over 100 million yuan to schools and educational charities across the province. So ask yourself this: why was it possible for a crime boss to do this? And what would happen to the reactions of those parents who found out that they might have, or should have, or possibly definitely should have sent their kids to this school instead of those ones? Because it carried a bad name? Who is really the criminal here? The so-called crime boss who built a school that could survive an 8.0 magnitude earthquake, or the government that jailed reporters for asking why that the schools it oversaw could not? There's a topic of resilience here. There's a topic of triumph, of victory against a natural disaster. And that's basically what the Chinese state media focused on. But the other images, the ones that we showed you, the ones where buildings fell, were possibly they shouldn't have in other countries, like Japan, which takes earthquake support and restrictions and measures very seriously. Why were the schools the ones that turned into rubbles and powder, but the offices of those government buildings remained? Well, sure, they were willing to show you the miracle, they just weren't willing to show you the crime. According to the Congressional Executive Commission on China, a U.S. government oversight body that monitors human rights in China, reports cited from the New York Times and LA Times at the time that just 2 hours after the earthquake struck, the party's Central Propaganda Department issued a directive prohibiting all media from sending reporters to the disaster zone, ordering all coverage to flow exclusively through state broadcaster CCTV and the official Xinhua news agency. Politburo member Li Changchun then convened a special meeting of propaganda officials instructing the press to prioritize positive propaganda, unity, and stability. Not 2.5 days after the earthquake, hours. Right, so before the scale of what had happened was eventually fully known, before the dust over those school buildings had settled, this was their immediate action, which is, again, that this was confirmed recently by a local reporter named Jin Yi, saying on a Chinese Weibo post that the restriction was taking place. He actually defied it and he tried to go in, and his superiors were like, "I can fire you," and then we wouldn't be in trouble for allowing you to go. And when the blackout was partially lifted, reporters allowed in were escorted under guided conditions, and they were directed away from the school collapse story. There were still some citizen journalists who later went to go investigate. Some of them got sent to jail, others got censored, some lost their jobs for reporting. And by late May, remember the earthquake was May 12th, parental protests grew louder. Officials explicitly ordered Chinese state media to fully report on the structural failures of school buildings altogether. A journalist in particular named Tan Zuoren, based in Sichuan province, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for attempting to document the multiple children that died in various classrooms and building collapse.
因为这一次天灾也好，这个人为也好，它的一些原因还没有查清楚。当时有媒体采访我的时候，我就讲到，北川中学的这一块大面积的粉碎性的楼房坍塌，特别是学校建筑的粉碎性坍塌，造成了大量的中小学生死亡的这样的事故，我认为是这个3分天灾7分人祸。
And a school teacher named Liu Shaokun was detained for posting photographs of the collapsed school buildings on the internet. And there was an activist named Huang Qi who was sentenced to 3 years in prison for criticizing the government's response on a human rights website. And he was held without access to his family for over 100 days before he was even allowed to get a lawyer. And those reporters who were permitted to enter, like Chai Jing, a well-known anchor from CCTV, were later told to participate in a recital of a poem in a post-quake celebration gala. She refused, and it contributed to her show eventually being canceled. And for the parents who were not arrested, there were some different instrument of silence, so to speak, using money. AFP reported directly from the ground in Dujiangyan in August of 2008 that parents were told that they would receive nothing if they refused to sign the compensation agreements, and you will turn out to find that this same type of forcing people to sign happens after every major and minor disasters and whatever incident or tragedy that happens in China. Those who signed were explicitly told to keep quiet and not speak to journalists, and a local shop owner near Julian Middle School told AFP the following: "The families have accepted compensation payments, and they have to accept the money because the police can be very terrifying. When they accept the money, they're told to keep quiet." And the moment enough parents had signed, the New York Times reported on September 4th, 2008, the local governments moved bulldozers into the collapsed school sites, destroying whatever physical evidence remained before investigators could examine it. So they paid the parents, then they buried the proof. And it goes further than that. Amnesty International published a full report on this, titled "Justice Denied: Harassment of Sichuan Earthquake Survivors and Activists." The report documented that the authorities subjected many parents to arbitrary detention and unlawful surveillance to stop them from pursuing legal remedies. Some of the parents were detained for up to 21 days simply for trying to seek answers, and some were detained repeatedly. The youngest person detained was 8 years old, and in a directive issued by the provincial court, all lower courts were banned from accepting cases related to the compensation of victims of the collapsed building. And the justice system was obviously not available to the regular people. And to understand why schools were the ones that fell, you sort of have to understand how social hierarchy really works in China. Because in China, it's often flipped. There's no serving the people, essentially. There's a phrase that perfectly captures the situation. It's called "let the leaders go first." This is a cemetery in a town near the border of Kazakhstan in China, in Xinjiang, called Karamay. And it holds nearly 300 people here, most of them children. The incident happened on December 8th, 1994. The Karamay Education Bureau organized a performance at the Friendship Hall Theater to welcome a visiting delegation of officials from Xinjiang education authorities. Nearly 800 students, teachers, and officials were packed into the Soviet-era venue, and the theater caught fire. 325 people died. 288 of them were school children. And the death rate of students and teachers hovered both around 40%. Doctors later determined that nearly 100 children did not die from the fire, but in the stampede during the evacuation. Some of the children's bodies reportedly bore the imprints of adult shoe prints, which meant that there was an order of chaos. By the order, I mean they were allowed to let the officials go first, and the chaos followed what happened after. Now, most of the local Karamay officials actually survived, and among the city education bureau leaders and visiting delegation heads, nearly all escaped, but the children filled the toll. In 1995, China Youth Daily published an article reporting on the phrase, "let the leaders go first." It described what the locals witnessed in those moments. The Chinese government has since released a bunch of these statements disputing that account, saying that, oh, the statement was incorrect. But in a documentary aired years later on by Phoenix TV, the people of Karamay maintained what they remembered.
让领导先走，
还让领导先走嘛？一直这样子想的，领导现在的学生听话的很呐，都坐了等了。
The leaders went first. So two things we can learn from the Karamay fire story. It is that the first, life of an official is way more valuable than the life of a child. And second, the CCP is willing to rewrite the story to erase that truth. Wenchuan was in 2008, and it basically followed the same logic as it did decades ago in the fire. One county government insider spent 4 years working in local government in Anhui province, wrote for the Lowry Institute that the words tofu-dried construction were already in daily use before the earthquake, describing schools being built on a fraction of the budget allocated to the county government buildings. So the fact of the matter is, letting leaders go is not simply as going to say that we let them leave the theater first. It's literally a social hierarchy of where people who are CCP officials stand versus the regular people. And that's also why the government building stood while the schools collapsed. An irrigation official he knew described the system as shaving. By not building something properly the first time, you create an endless pipeline of repair contracts for your friends and relatives. The corruption was not just occasional, it was structural. It was actually the system, because it's all about making money for the individual officials. If they truly cared, they would not have built the school buildings like a block of tofu. And children and students were never the priority. The officials were. Wenchuan was 18 years ago. But if you think that is part of history and nothing else gets repeated, we'll just consider what happened on July 23rd of 2023. In the city of Qiqihar in northeastern China, the gymnasium roof of middle school number 34 collapsed during a girls' volleyball practice. 17 students and 2 coaches were inside. 11 of them died. As reported by Reuters and South China Morning Post, the official explanation was that a construction crew working on a nearby building had illegally stored bags of perlite, a highly absorbent mineral, on top of the gymnasium for months, and heavy rain soaked through those bags and the weight built and the roof gave away. A building full of children came down because someone used the school roof as a construction storage yard, and no one was in a position of authority bothered to check. I personally question that excuse, because why would you store something on another building's roof? Because it would take you forever to transfer the material when you need it. But again, the questions that were followed were the same questions parents asked in 2008. Was the gymnasium structurally sound to begin with? What happens next will basically follow the exact same script as 2008. China Digital Times documented that parents at the hospital were confronted by police and officials who pressured them to sign documents before they were even allowed to identify their daughter's bodies. One father, speaking on video before he went silent, said, "They tell me my daughter is gone, but we never even got to see the child." And then you saw the flowers and the tribute that people laid outside of the school gates. Those were then censored too. The names of the girls were scrubbed from social media, and the mourning was managed, contained, and erased. 15 years after Wenchuan, the playbook had not changed by a single bit. Now, a new generation of people in China probably only know the Wenchuan earthquake through these old documentaries that praise the disaster response of CCP officials and soldiers, and the images of collapsed school buildings are probably never seen before. The names of the children who died in those classrooms have long been forgotten, and more disasters have followed, one after another, and they all end the same way, buried beneath new headlines, pushed down the memory hole. But look at these people. These are the parents of the Wenchuan children, 18 years later, some of them elderly, still standing outside of the government buildings, still holding photographs of their sons and daughters, still demanding that somebody, anyone, say the names and admit what happened. The state wanted them to grieve quietly and move on. They refused. This is perhaps the real tragedy of China. Not just that things happen, but that every instrument of power, the media blackout ordered within hours of the earthquake, the arrests of journalists and activists, the bulldozers sent to destroy the evidence, the hush money handed to parents with a warning to stay silent. Courts, justice systems turn them away. From Wenchuan in 2008 to Qiqihar in 2023 to now 2026, we still see the same type of videos. We have tofu drag that still exists in China. The same system, it hasn't been able to produce anything else. It's because nobody wants anything to change. And honestly, if anybody dares to ask why, well, they tell you it's because, well, it was bad. It was 8.0. And yet we still have situations like this happening in China. So what really changed? Well, nothing really. The only thing that didn't change, I guess, would be the parents who still remember that day like it was yesterday. And I guess the goal for us is to keep this alive and remember. So thank you very much for watching this episode of Unclassified China, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Did you remember this event in the news back then? And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.